Hi guys, this is Asal. I'm studying for the bar and I wanted to review my notes with you. So today I'm studying torts and I'm studying vicarious liability right here. It's actually a very important one because it pops up in a lot of your classes later on when you're in your second year or in your last year of law school. If you take a business association class, you'll see vicarious liability come up a lot in that class. You'll see it in the agency relationships, you'll see it in the partnership, you'll see it in the joint ventures. You kind of have to distinguish and understand when somebody is held vicariously liable. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to define it first. So, a defendant is held liable for actions of a second defendant based on the relationship between them, not because the first defendant was at fault. So, what do I mean by this? Vicarious liability is when people are trying to search for the deep pockets, for the richer guy. So there's always that employer, that employee, that master, that servant relationship, and something goes wrong. Let's say the employee or the servant does something wrong, and the people don't want to be suing the servant or the employee. They want to be suing the deep pockets, which is the employer. Okay, so that's where vicarious liability comes from, and it is under the doctrine of respondeat superior, which says, let the boss answer. So the rule is employers may be held liable for employees' torts committed in the scope of their employment. So that's very important, as long as it is in the scope of the employment. The next thing I would like to talk about are the elements of respondeat superior. I have it right here. You see 1, 2. So the first element is the relationship of the employer and the employee must exist, with the primary tortfeasor being the employee and the party sought to be held vicariously liable being the employer. Okay, it's right here. And then the second one right here is when the employee committed the underlying tort, he must have been acting within the scope of his employment, what I just said. So always pay attention with the difference of the employees and the independent contractors. In fact, I suggest that on a piece of paper, you write on one side employee, and then on the other side, you write independent contractor. And then you kind of want to compare the difference between the two because they're very different. So the next thing I would like to talk about is the idea of control. So existence of the employee-employer relationship depends on the extent to which the alleged employer controls the actions and performance of the employee. So the idea of control is very important. On your exam, I suggest you head note it. You say control, and then you talk about it. The degree of control the employer exercises over the person is the key question. That's what I said. For example, let's say that someone is trying to get rid of an intruder. There's a boss, he's trying to get rid of an intruder. He hires a security and he says, get rid of the intruder. So, is that hiring the security, is the security an employee or an independent contractor? I'm going to give another example. Let's say that you want to do gardening or you want to do plumbing, and then you hire somebody to come into your home to do your plumbing for you. So does that person become your employee, or are they an independent contractor? Again, another example, I work at a law office. So I've told my boss, I am an independent contractor. What does this mean? This means that if something goes wrong, I don't want my boss to be held liable. I can take care of myself. So that's how that works. So you got to pay attention to that. The rule here is an employee is an agent whose employer control or has the right to control the way in which the employee performs the work. So that's very important. The factors that determine if the agent is an employee or an independent contractor, over here, I'm going to name about 7 factors, okay? So just try to keep up with me. The first one is whether the agent is engaged in the agent's own distinct occupation. The second one is whether the type of work done by the agent is customarily done independently or with supervision. The third one is the degree of specialized skill required in the agent's occupation. The fourth one is whether the agent of the principal supplies the tools. So it's very important. You want to look at who's supplying the tools. So if the gardener is coming to your home, are you giving him the tools to work for you, or is he coming with his own tools? The next thing is the length of time during which the agent is engaged by the principal. The sixth one is whether the agent is paid by the job or by the time worked. And then finally, the last one is whether the agent's work is a part of the principal's regular business. So you gotta pay attention to that when you're trying to distinguish between an employee and an independent contractor. For an employer to be held vicariously liable for an employee's torts, the employee must have been acting within the scope of employment. It's right here, when committing the tort. So I keep on saying within the scope of employment, but what do I mean by within the scope of employment? What I mean by that, there are three requirements which comes out of the second restatement of the agency. So the first requirement is the conduct giving rise to the tort is the kind of work the employee is employed to perform, okay? And then the second one, it occurs substantially within the authorized time and space limits imposed by the employer, okay? And then the third one is it is by a purpose to serve the employer. So these three is very important. The conduct giving rise to the tort is the kind of work the employee is employed to perform. It occurs substantially within the authorized time and space limits imposed by the employer. And then the third, purpose to serve the employer. So you kind of want to compare that. So if he performs work assigned by the employer and acts in accordance with the employer's management, then he's acting within the scope of employment. But if he acts independently without the intention of serving the employer, that's not acting within the scope of employment. So that's the difference there. And then the next thing I would like to talk about is motive or foreseeability. So what is that person's motive when they're doing something? So it is usually clear whether or not employee's conduct was within the scope of employment. So you can kind of see what they're doing. The next thing is the going and coming rule. The going and coming rule. So this is actually very important because the going and coming rule is what happens when someone is going to work and coming back from work. So is that considered within the scope of employment? Let's say someone gets in a car accident while they're trying to get to work or while they're trying to drive back to home. No, that is not within the scope of employment unless the boss tells him, okay, so now that you're going home, on your way home, could you please deposit my check? And like he gives him some chores to run, which is related to the work, then there's an exception there. And then the next thing I would like to talk about is frolics and detours. So that's very important, the difference between frolic and detour. Because with a frolic, it's like a very serious deviation, whereas a detour is a very small deviation. A detour is a minor deviation from the employer's business during the course of conduct, whereas a frolic is a significant departure from the time and space constraints of the job. So, for example, what do I mean by that? I would like to give you an example. So a lot of people, like when they're on the job, they go out back and they want to smoke a cigarette and they accidentally set fire to something. People do that. They set fire to stuff accidentally. So let's say that person who just went out for a cigarette. So was that a frolic or was that a detour? It really depends. So let's say a person is a gardener, and maybe a gardener is not a good example, but just something like that. Just imagine someone is like doing the work, they're out in the open, and then they decide to pop up their cigarette and put one in their mouth as they're working. That is not a frolic. But if they like clock out and step out of the building and start smoking a cigarette like that, then there's a difference over there. The next thing I would like to talk about are the intentional torts. So what happens when someone commits an intentional tort on the job? Let's say someone ends up punching someone or just anything intentional on the job. So to find the employer is liable for the employee's intentional torts, the courts look for the stronger nexus between the conditions related to the employee's job and the commission of the tort. So there are three factors to find if intentional tort was within the scope of employment. The first one is the act is one that is fairly and naturally incident to the employer's business. The second one, the act is done while the employee is doing employer's business. And then also, finally, the third one is the act arises from some impulse or emotion that naturally emanated from the attempt to perform the employer's business. So what do I mean by that? So I mean, picture a security guard and all these drunk people, they're trying to get in a club, they're trying to get to the bar, and then the security guard kind of like pushes the person away. So if that happens, that intentional tort, the security guard is doing it within the scope of his employment, and he's doing it for his employment. He's kind of telling people to keep their distance, and he's doing that for his employment. So that's pretty much everything I wanted to talk about in vicarious liability. So when you think about vicarious liability, just think about these two things: the existence of the employer-employee relationship and the tort committed within the scope of employment. And then finally, look at what it means for a scope of employment. What is frolic? What is detour? So on your exam, what you want to do is you want to write down the liability and torts, and then come down and you want to write down the existence of employer-employee relationships, describe that, and then you want to describe the scope of employment also. There's a lot to say in that. So I really hope you enjoy studying. That's pretty much everything I wanted to say about vicarious liability. Have fun. Cheers.